Welcome to Authors at Drucker. I'm Dave Specht, Senior Fellow at the Drucker School of Management. At the Drucker School, we aspire to become the global meeting place for the world's most influential business-owning families. Today's conversation represents progress towards that objective. Authors at Drucker is an interview series where we feature top authors that write about issues impacting these business-owning families. Authors at Drucker is made possible from the generous sponsorship of the James E. Hughes Jr. Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to advancing the study of family governance and generational well-being. We at the Drucker School feel very aligned and very grateful to Jay and his foundation. On the last Authors at Drucker, we featured Pierre Yves Dons. Pierre is a professor of business history at Osaka University's Graduate School of Economics. He's the author of a book called The Making of a Status Symbol, A Business History of Rolex. If you missed that conversation, I would highly encourage you to go to our YouTube channel or the website and check out the replay. Today, I am lucky to be joined by my friend Mark Englizian. Mark is the author of a book that is officially being released today, so we are a part of the actual launch, which I'm grateful for. The book is called Stakeholders, the Intersection of Human Beings in the Ecosystem of Business. Mark's a retired HR executive that's worked with companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and Walgreens, just to name a few. Mark, thanks for joining us on launch day, and welcome to Authors at Drucker.
Thank you very much, Dave. My pleasure.
So how are you feeling on launch day? Just take us behind the scenes. I mean, not everyone's an author on the call here. What's launch day like?
Well, actually, it's kind of anticlimactic because, when you work on something for about 18 to 24 months, I slept just fine last night. I've had my coffee this morning, so it's just kind of a normal Thursday morning here in Central Oregon. You can see the beautiful mountains in the background there.
Well, we're glad you're spending launch day with us. Mark, there's been a lot of books written about management and leadership, ownership, shareholders, but I don't know if there are other books written about stakeholders. So tell us why. Tell us about stakeholders and why you chose to focus your time and attention to write a book on stakeholders.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. When you work with a publisher, they want to know, who else has written about this, and um, a pretty thorough scan of the availability of other writing on this topic was, slim to none at the time that I started working on it probably 2 years ago. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is it's really about an ecosystem, um, of business. And so it doesn't just focus on, um, a silo aspect of it, whether it's customers or leaders. A lot of books have been written about leadership, obviously. Not that many books have been written about customers, interestingly enough. But what was unique about, my thought process going into thinking about this in terms of the content was that I was focused on the ecosystem and the people who make up that ecosystem. Typically, when we think of people in business, we think of employees, and we don't necessarily think of the rest of them as people, but they are. There's a lot of different types of human beings that are referred to as customers or investors or shareholders or whatever it is. And so, if you take a holistic view of the entire ecosystem and how our humanity sort of feeds into that, I think was definitely and is unique. So that's kind of the thought process and the genesis in my mind of why I decided to write about this.
So, Mark, as I was reading the book and I was thinking about executives from all over the country and all over the world reading this book, I had these competing thoughts, and I want you to take me through this and walk this back for me. But on the one hand, I thought, man, if CEOs read this and actually understand the complexity of the decisions that they're making from a strategy perspective, they might all freeze and not be able to make decisions. Or on the flip side, if they understand who the stakeholders are, they may come to great clarity and make much better decisions. So help me out with those polarities. Where are we?
Well, great question. So first of all, I did have a number of CEOs in my network of professional acquaintances read this book ahead of time because I wanted to get their perspective. So that's number one. Number two is what I will tell you is they're already freaked out before they read this book. Okay, let's be clear about the difference between their public persona and what they're laying awake at night, thinking about and what's keeping them awake at night. So there's already a lot of emotional angst, business anxiety, um, uh, terror, in the cases of some that I spoke to, loneliness,
Yeah.
isolationism. I mean, this is not an easy job, and I'm sure a lot of your clients, Dave, and a lot of the people that you know in family-owned businesses, a lot of the people that I know in corporate America, if they were to be truly honest and transparent about how they're feeling, they're already freaked out. So that's the first thing. Um, what I've tried to do is to try to calm them down a little bit as a group and say, yeah, this is complex, but it doesn't need to be as difficult as you might think, because if you really know who your stakeholder groups are, and you've listened to them and you've learned from them, and you really are willing to adapt what you're doing to accommodate people in both a survive and thrive environment, then it doesn't become easier, but it becomes more clear as to what you need to do and how you need to lead. And so when I say that, when I introduce it that way, leaders are intrigued as to, what this new type of stakeholder perspective might cause them to do differently.
Well, my lens is looking through the book and looking at what's next for me. And I have two family meetings coming up. Both of them are third generation moving to fourth generation. And as you introduced all the different stakeholders, I thought that really needs to happen in that family meeting. And what I think will happen is that there'll be greater empathy for all those that attend the meeting to understand the complexities that the leaders are navigating. And from a family business perspective, it's like cash flow to the family, dividends. How do we keep them, how do we create proper expectations? How do we keep them happy? How do we keep enough assets in the business for the growth engine? There's so many different competing interests. How do we retain? How do we attract great talent? Not underpay them so that there's churn, not overpay them so that there's not profitability. I mean, this can be just paralyzing, Mark. But I
Yeah.
think it's an empathy play more than anything. If people understand the complexities, not just the CEO understanding the complexities, but if shareholders understand the complexities and all the competing interests of all the stakeholders, I think there's a little bit of empathy extended towards those that
I think you're really onto that last sentence, Dave, and that is that it isn't just the leadership listening, learning, and leading from a position of empathy, but it's really multi-channel communication across the stakeholder groups so that everybody understands what the competing priorities are, or the competing interests, I should say, and how prioritization happens. So one of the things I talk about in the chapter called priorities is that in my experience, priorities get set in one of three ways. One is adhering to the mission and values of the organization. Nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly legit. All right. Another sort of approach to setting priorities is adapting to the leadership style of the leaders. Okay. This tends to be a little bit more one-sided, a little bit more it's easier to take pot shots at it.
yeah.
Okay. And the third is to take the stakeholder approach, which is we listen, we learn, and then we lead. And it is empathic, but it also is honest in saying everybody's going to get something, but nobody's going to get everything they want. Okay. Let's just start there. and realize that if one stakeholder, let's just say customers or investors, gets everything they want, then this organization is going to die.
Yeah.
Okay. And so if you need to be that sort of bold and courageous saying it that way, you need to look no further than Blockbuster, right? Um, Blockbuster could have owned Netflix for probably $25 million 25 years ago. And I know that because Amazon offered them 17 million and Netflix turned it down. Would they have taken 25? Would they have taken 50? Would they have taken 100? The only thing that Blockbuster, the mistake they made was not understanding that their customers were in love with the convenience of Netflix. Blockbuster doesn't exist today
Yeah.
because they lost track of knowing what matters to their customers.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the book, you start with, I was a little surprised actually. You start with money matters and you go about defining, annual revenues, cost of goods sold, net profits, net income. Why did you feel the need to begin with these money measures before you kind of prepared us to teach us about stakeholders?
So I have an admission to make.
Okay.
My whole career I've kind of introduced myself as an HR leader, and 50% of the people roll their eyes because they don't really understand HR. They don't know what to do with it. They think HR is a nuisance. My own wife had a wonderful career, and when you asked her what was the least favorite part of her job, she said HR. you know, so so I've been mildly defensive about this for some time, and my way of sort of dealing with it personally was to say I'm going to be a business person first, okay? And if I'm going to write a business book, then we need to get on the same page about what we mean about business. And so that was really, some of the incentive for me to start that way, Dave. But the other thing is that right after Money Matters, we create the case study, right? And the case study is a fictional story that's based on all my experiences over the years, many of those experiences with family-owned businesses. And the case study is a family-owned business that started in 1982, a home and hardware store in DeKalb, Illinois. And in order to understand the case study and how the concept of stakeholders applies inside the case study, I had to start with a foundation of what do we mean by cost of goods sold, and what do we mean by a G&A expense, and what do we mean by gross and net profit, and all those kinds of things, because I would constantly come back to the case study to put what I was saying conceptually in very pragmatic terms. So that's really kind of why I started that way. And you aren't the only one who sort of had a little bit of a surprise, but
No, it's good. I'm curious, how much of an anomaly are you in the HR world to take the kind of business first approach? Because it seems like if you're an HR leader, you'd better understand these things as you're kind of lobbying for the strategies that you think are best for the company from an HR perspective. But how much of an anomaly are you amongst your peers in taking that approach? What
well, it's a little bit hard for me to answer that question, but I think I am to some extent, only because people have told me that. So I never took a business class in undergrad or grad school. I was starting from, less than zero. But I had people early in my career who I had a general manager who invited his senior staff into his office at 5:30 in the afternoon for beers that he would pull out of his little fridge in his office, and we didn't sit there talking about people. We sat there and talked about business.
Yeah.
And I would get invited to weekly and quarterly and monthly business reviews because these were people who thought that I had maybe some instinctive DNA that would allow me to benefit from learning that stuff and maybe even contribute, which I then learned how to do. So I mean, you asked me, a question offline about finance and HR, which we may get to, but I considered it a privilege to get to know my chief financial officers in a very deep and personal way. John Connors was my CFO at Microsoft. Tom Skutak was at Amazon. Wade Mickelon was at Walgreens. And the reason is because I wanted to be a business person first, and I wanted them to see that that was my perspective. Yeah, I may be something of an anomaly, probably less so now than 20 or 30 years ago, because I think a lot of people have come out of operations or out of marketing or out of finance to lead HR organizations, and I think that's helped bring some reputational gravitas to the function as well.
So let's go there then. Let's talk about this. I would call it a necessary tension between finance and HR. Talk about how first of all, many family companies, I feel like, build out and strengthen the HR function last or late, I would say. And many are kind of there's a lot of informality with regards to the HR process. But can you talk about the natural tension between finance and HR, and why a healthy tension there can actually lead to a lot of success?
Yeah, happy to, but let me first of all make a comment about the last thing you said, and that is that I don't necessarily think that an HR function is one of the first things an organization should do. There's definitely people activity like recruiting, right? Like training, like developing people, like paying people properly. To me, that's the those are initiatives, activity, um, operational uh, groundwork that needs to happen in any business um, if you're going to employ people, and almost all businesses do. Um, whether you need the structure of an HR department or team is a different question.
Okay.
Um, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for HR activity to be embedded in the divisions of the business.
Hmm.
But because it tends to be something of a specialized discipline or field, kind of like legal, um, or other corporate communications, those kinds of things. We tend to sort of create this appendage we call HR, and then we wonder, maybe why we did it, or how much investment there should be. So that's the first thing I would say. Back to this tension between finance and HR. I've had to stand up in front of lots of teams of managers and leaders over the years, and one of the questions I like to sort of pose at the beginning of my little talk is, and I spent a good portion of my career in the compensation arena. I would start by saying, so why do we need compensation department in this company anyway? And they'd look around and they go, yeah, that's a great question. Why do we even need people like you? And I'd say, well, let me say it to you this way. What if we let the members of the finance team determine everybody's wages? And they'd look around and they go, well, yeah, what's your point? I'd say, well, I mean, would anybody be making more than minimum wage
Yeah, people are
other than other than the finance team themselves?
an
Right.
expense to them. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then I said, well, let's go to the opposite extreme. And what if we let every employee determine their own salary?
I'm sure that would work well.
Oh, well, that wouldn't work out very well. We wouldn't have any business left. So then I'd say, so you see that the extremes are not viable in a for-profit business environment. And so there needs to be someone who's looking at this differently and finding, and usually we look to the marketplace, right? So, once sort of people understand that we need to partner together, that both the finance team and the HR team really are looking at how to best invest our resources in this business, then you can find a lot of common ground.
Yeah. Sustainability is a very buzzy word these days. How might the stakeholder perspective help an executive team manage towards business sustainability?
So, in the vernacular of the stakeholders book, sustainability is called survive and thrive. And there's really, two elements of that. And it really sort of depends on where a business is in its life cycle. Um, some businesses are on the verge of not surviving. And the actions that a leadership team takes, the alternatives that they're considering are very different in that kind of scenario, right? If you're just trying to, get by from 1 week or 1 month or 1 year to the next, that's a very different proposition than being in a growth environment, where, you're just trying to keep up with customer demand or, whatever it might be. And so this is where, not all stakeholders are created equal, right? At all times, right? And in fact, I would argue there's never a time when there's a perfect equilibrium between the leadership posture toward all stakeholders. There are going to be times when the interests of investors is probably more important than anything, or there's a time when interest in customers, or there's a time when there's high interest in the community, in the communities in which we operate. So there is a natural, I think, organic ebb and flow to who you pay attention to more. It's not any different than parenting, actually. um I'm the father to four children, and they're all very, very different. They're from the oldest to the youngest, they're 12 years apart. And they all want and need different things because they are individuals. And the worst mistake I could have made as a parent was to father all of them exactly the same way. And that wouldn't have worked out very well. So there's there's an acknowledgement that in order to sustain, um, you need to adapt to whatever your circumstance is and to whoever you need to pay the most attention to at any given point in time.
Yep. I think it's a good answer. In family businesses, there's this complex tension between owners, employees, family members, and there's challenges, varied risk preferences. People are at different ages and stages in their lives. There's this balance of liquidity, like who are we? Are we a growth company? Are we a growth and income company? And I think the stakeholder approach can help them clarify some of that. But as you think of some of the like competing interests in these family businesses, what guidance would you provide leaders as they navigate the needs of all of them and build a strategy for the business?
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to sort of a fundamental perspective that the stakeholders approach is, and that is to, first of all, identify who your stakeholders are. And that's not the same answer for every organization. Um, my particular point of view comes from sort of large corporate America, and that's fine. Okay. The fictitious story of Hanson's Home and Hardware, which is a family-owned business that started with a single store and grew to, a $2 billion enterprise over 40 years, is a different perspective, right? If you are a middle school principal, like my son-in-law is, he's going to identify stakeholders that definitely includes parents. Mine doesn't. His is going to include taxpayers. Mine doesn't, right? And so, if you're a different kind of organization, you're not going to come up with the same list of stakeholders I did from my perspective. So that's where it starts. So who are my stakeholders? Secondly, you need to ask yourself, Do I know what matters most to them? And in my case, in writing this book, I tried to get that down to one or two words.
Yeah,
Just
take us through some of those. Take us through
yeah,
some.
and this is hard to do. Okay, so I'll take you through sort of the story of Hanson's and start by saying partners. What matters to them is that they win. That's all that matters. They just want to win. And partners are the landlord. They're the bankers. They're the early stage investors, etc. Suppliers want to compete. Customers want value. It's just that simple. It's complex, but it's simple. Employees are not a homogenous group. I broke out employees into three stakeholder groups. Frontline workers just want to get by. If they're paying their bills, they may want more than that, but what matters most to them is to stay afloat at home. Managers want advancement, and executives want to accumulate. Um, Investors want return, and communities want to preserve the quality of life that they currently enjoy. You look at the background behind me. If you put a heavy industrial smokestack up in front of those three mountains there, they're called the Sisters Mountains, three of them, you would destroy the quality of life of this community. Okay. So the community isn't going to allow that. Okay. So um, it's really important that you identify who the stakeholders are unique to your business and that you know enough about them, that you spend time with them, that you ask questions, that you listen and you learn, so that you know what matters most to them. There's nothing more important from the perspective of leading through stakeholder lens than doing those two things.
Well, and from a community perspective, I don't know if you call it out specifically, but most large family businesses are kind of key philanthropists in the town that they happen to be from. And that has to be, they have to be considered as a part of the stakeholder group and also a part of the allocation of resources because people are coming to ask for help, and unless there's a strategy that the business and the family has developed, that family can feel drawn and quartered by that constituent group alone, and figuring out, okay, how much do we keep for the family, how much do we provide liquidity for the family, how much do we keep in the business for growth, how much do we interact with the community, make donations in the community. I mean, it is so complex, but again, I think by at least having all the stakeholders present in our minds and understanding what their needs are, what their wants are, we can also anticipate when it comes to time to make a big decision, to make a tough decision. All right, let's walk through the stakeholder groups. How's this going to land on them? And it has the potential for us to de-risk, some of the big decisions that we are making or how we announce some of those big decisions. And I think far too few people are taking the time to think about the stakeholder group before they make some of these big moves. I'd love
Totally
your.
agree with you. Couldn't have said it better, Dave. Um, the community is oftentimes a forgotten piece in this ecosystem. I think it's incredibly important, just like you mentioned. Hershey, Pennsylvania is not named Hershey by accident. Okay. That is a company town. If you've ever been there, I've been there. The street light lamps are shaped like Hershey Kisses. I kid you not. Okay. This is a company town. um, and when you operate in and I'll just take the fictitious company that I made up in DeKalb, Illinois. Um, when the founder, Ted Hanson, went to Northern Illinois University and partnered up with a business professor and began a decades-long relationship with that university. And they came to him and they said, we want to create a bachelor's degree in retail management, and we'd like your company to create an endowment to support this. He said, yes, right?
Yeah.
That's an example of understanding your role in the community. And so I say in my book, you want the name of your company on the wall of the little league outfield home run, fence, or whatever it is. You want your organization to be the lead sponsor to the Fourth of July parade or whatever it is, because you want the members of that community to know and understand that you value them as customers, you value them as neighbors, as a source of employment, and you are actively and intentionally investing in that community. It's a super important point.
Yeah, one of the key challenges I think is that's underestimated from a leader perspective and an ownership perspective is, you see all this private equity and M&A activity that's going on specifically with family businesses, and from a stakeholder perspective, just what happens, when a company in Hershey, Pennsylvania, or when a company in my little town sells and there's 400 employees, and that represents, a sixth of the town's size. What's the impact of one decision to sell that company? It's like, yes, the family and the leaders are going to celebrate. That's a victory. It's a harvest moment, but it's also a time where like it's this going to send a ripple effect through the entire stakeholder group. I mean, the lender that may be local is probably out. The employment situation of many of those 400 may come into question if they choose to consolidate, their facilities. And so I just think it's such a great framework for so many different reasons. And, just that one of an M&A consideration, these are really hard decisions we're asking individuals to make about the future of not only of a company, of a family, but also of a community and of all the touching stakeholders. So
Yeah.
challenging.
So there's a couple of things I want to comment on. You talked about how hard it is. I want to talk about that second. But let's talk about the first thing you said, which is, what is the experience like when the owner is absent or distant or unknown or anonymous?
Yeah.
These are ownership arrangements that are much more common today than they've ever been in the history of this country. Okay. And, remember, we 200 or 300 years ago, we were an agrarian society where you owned your land, you owned your activity. The ownership couldn't have been more clear. Okay. Now, today, it is very, very cloudy. So whether you're an absentee parent or an absentee CEO or an absentee owner or whatever it is, you do not have the familiarity with your customer, client, stakeholder, whatever you want to call them, that you need to have to survive and thrive. That's my point of view. Okay. Now let's talk about the difficulty that you referred to with the leader and sort of what should we say? Sort of balancing all these competing interests. Is that really
Yeah.
what you're talking about? Yeah. So let me use a metaphor I used in the book. It's the difference between traveling 5 miles going through an intersection of traffic lights or traveling 5 miles going through intersections managed by roundabouts. Okay. And traffic engineers will tell you that they're putting in roundabouts um, as fast as they can in communities all over this country, because there's a science that says that traffic you can get from point A to point B in a more efficient, safe, and timely manner. That's why they do it. Organizations today, many of them, the leadership sort of structure and the decision-making structure is more like a traffic light. Everybody comes from north, south, east, and west. These are the stakeholder groups with their own unique ideas about where they're going and how fast they're going to get there. Okay. Everybody stops and waits. for the CEO, who's the traffic cop in this case, to give them the green light, and the others are grumpy because they have to wait.
Yeah.
Whereas in the traffic circle or the roundabout, people have to slow down, but they get to keep moving. Inertia is not the issue. It is the application of energy, and it requires a different skill set. You don't have to pay attention to a light. You do have to pay attention to your left and to your right, and you need to keep moving, right? Or else the traffic circle is meaningless, right? It's just as poor of a mechanism as the traffic light. So if you think about that, it isn't necessarily that it's more difficult. My opinion, Dave, is that it just requires a different skill set.
Okay. Well, I have to tell you, I lived in Uruguay for 2 years, and my first experience with a 4-lane roundabout, I was longing for stoplights. Um, but
By the way, the worst roundabout in the world, the worst one I've ever encountered, let me qualify that, is the one that's around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, right? I mean, it is chaotic. And now if you go at the right time of day, it's smooth, but nothing's perfect. No metaphor is perfect.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I want to pause now and give the audience an opportunity to start submitting questions in the chat because I don't want to hog all of Mark's attention. So feel free to begin to put your questions in the chat, and then in a few minutes, I'll open it up to you guys for an opportunity to ask Mark questions.
Hey, so as you're doing that, can I just take a mild turn and talk about something that you and I talked about ahead of time?
Go for
And
it.
that is the concept of repurposing investments. So so one of the things that drives leaders crazy is people constantly coming to them asking them for money or capital improvement or more labor or whatever it is. It ends up that all of these things cost something, and it's really hard to know how to manage the prioritization of these requests and so on and so forth. And one of the things I learned was that I got a very different response if I went to a CEO or a CFO and said, hey, I want to do XYZ. It's going to cost $3 million. But net to you, it's going to cost nothing because I'm going to fund it by defunding this thing over here we're doing for $3 million, right? So I call that repurposing investments. And the story I use is of Nike and their golf business, okay? Nike didn't have a golf business until 1997 when Tiger Woods became a phenom, okay? Nike was in the running shoe business, okay? That was their primary business, going all the way back to the 60s and 70s, when only 2 hours drive from here, Bill Bowerman and his athlete Phil Knight, invented this waffle-soled shoe that they literally patterned using a waffle iron. Okay, I don't know if people know that story.
Yep.
But Nike got into golf business because of the celebrity of Tiger Woods, and 20 years later, in around 2007 or 18, they took a look at their golf business and they said, you know what? We've never made any money with this. Between what we're spending on the endorsements, on the endorsement contract with Tiger Woods and others, and our profit margins and our cost of goods sold and all this and that, this has been a loss leader for us for 2 decades. And at the same time, they went over and they looked at their running shoe business and they said, we're losing market share to Hoka and to Cloudmaster. And somebody, I don't know who, but somebody stood up and said, I got an idea. Let's defund golf. Let's get out of the golf business and let's take whatever we've been investing in that and repurpose it into our running shoe business because we're losing ground to some new competitors. That's an example of how you repurpose a legacy investment.
Peter Drucker is smiling on
you get more of what you want and need without increasing your total spend. That's the beauty of it.
Peter Drucker is smiling down on you right now, Mark, because he had this concept of systematic abandonment. And
Mhm.
basically he wouldn't be in a strategy session unless systematic abandonment was on the agenda. And what that means is we're actively looking to kill things. We're actively looking to stop doing things that are taking our attention, our time, our resources, so that we can open up our minds to the innovation that is in front of us. And I think far too few family businesses in particular, but businesses in general, are actively looking to kill products and things that may have been legacy winners. And that's maybe what makes them so difficult, is it may have been a product that allowed them to survive. Maybe it was the growth engine for a decade. And it's hard to say, we don't need you anymore, and we're
Yep.
going to reallocate. But I love the concept, and I think it's crucial. So thanks for that. All right. I think we have our first question in the chat. So let's jump to Dan. Dan, do you want to take yourself off mute and join the conversation with us? Thanks for joining. I think you're muted maybe on your computer still. Give you just a second.
You bet. Sorry, that should be better.
You're good now.
Apologies. Thanks for the amazing discussion conversation today. Bit of a general question, but Dave had the chance to read your books recently. Mark, look forward to reading yours. If you were to look around my office, it is littered with books, all of which have brilliant ideas, brilliant systems, brilliant analogies. And as I go along this journey and learning more and more about sort of what my purpose is, I'm realizing I'd like to have a vehicle to contain these things as I go so that it's not just in my head, right? Like the owner founder and the systems around it. So, Mark, your comments on, when the publisher said, what else has been written on this book? And you have to do a hard job of not saying what there is, but what there isn't, right? And being relatively confident with that. So it's a broad landscape. So I wondered if both you and Dave could just speak to your habits and practices for, as you're reading these resources, as you're getting these ideas, how you're cataloging them and ensuring that you can kind of circle back with the breadcrumbs to go, right, systematic abandonment, here's an article on this, or just so that we're not left to our short-term memory and we can really build that legacy throughout our careers.
Yeah, interesting question, Dan. I'd love to hear Dave's perspective too, but I'll jump in first. So when I was in leadership roles in the companies that we talked about, I learned something interesting about myself, Dan, and that is that I'm not a particularly innovative or creative person in a vacuum, but I love collaborating with other people and discussing new ideas, or looking at things in a different way. And so, in whether it was a small team or a large team, I really learned about myself that I was more likely to thrive in that kind of an environment. And when you're on a team or in a team or leading a team, you can say, "Look, that's an interesting idea. Who would like to volunteer to look into that further, right?" And then we kind of all agree that Dan in this case would be the person who would volunteer to do that, and we wouldn't give Dan any particular guidance other than to say, Dan, when do you think you can come back to us and give us the benefit of your research? And Dan would say 2 weeks, and we'd come back 2 weeks later, and we'd then now interact with a whole new set of facts and circumstances. So, as an author, what I can tell you is that I have on my smartphone, I have a little app that's called Notes, and I put things in there every single day. And some of it is from reading the Wall Street Journal every morning. Others, it's a conversation that I've had with somebody like Dave or my good friend Debbie Brown, who's on this call, or my wife or one of my kids who are very smart, and I love talking to them, or my neighbor Rusty next door, or whatever it is. And I make notes to myself all the time about new or interesting things I'm hearing or thinking about. And then I revisit that pretty often, and say, is there an article in here? Is there a book in here? Is there a new thought in here? And then I try it out on people. I'll call up my friend Dave and I'll say, hey, Dave, I've been thinking about this. Or I'll throw something in a LinkedIn post and ask people to jump in and say, is this new and refreshing, or is this just taking out the trash. Those are my ways. What would you say, Dave?
Well, I'll take specifically this Authors at Drucker series. I mean, before all this journey started, I would say to people, I'm not a reader. And I hated that because it was a symbol to me that somehow I wasn't curious or whatever. But I struggled to retain, and I was a slow reader, and I wanted to change that. So one of the things I did was I committed to reading and interviewing an author in public every month. So I had no choice but to become a reader. I had no choice. And so I took that away from myself, and then I changed my language. And I don't say that about myself anymore. So that was one thing that, but even deeper into Authors at Drucker, I'm reading so many books that it is tough, Dan, because it's like, oh, it's just washing through your brain, and like, what can I really take? How many things can you really hold on to? I would say there's one concept that has really helped things to stick for me, and it's teach it or lose it. So if I hear something in an Authors at Drucker or I read it in a book, unless I quickly teach that to someone, it's gone. I may remember it if someone triggers it in my mind, but unless I teach that thing to someone else, like my kids or, a coworker, it's gone. The other strategy I've used is I have an assistant that's helped me a little bit with some of this work, and I had her use AI and go through all the transcripts. Basically, she fed the transcripts into AI and said, what are the top 3 things that you learned from Mark Englizian in the interview? And so AI created the prompts for me, and then it was like, yeah, I mean, that's it. But then it couldn't stop there. Now I have to write about it, so that'll become a LinkedIn post, and it can't be AI's LinkedIn post. It needs to be mine, because then that's my platform to teach. So I'm a slow learner. I have to hear it, I have to read it, I have to teach it, then I have to talk about it again. And most stuff will not stay in my head unless I'm doing those things, Dan. I don't know if that.
I think that's really good advice. I would just add one thing, Dan. I learned about myself to only read one book at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I used to try to manage 2 or 3, um, you know, and these were in the analog days where you carried books around. Now it's it's so easy to be reading multiple things, because your access to them is so easy. But just read one thing at a time, and absorb it, learn from it, do something about it, like Dave said, and then move on to something else.
That's great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
That was not a softball question, Dan. I'm looking for a softball question next. No, I'm just kidding. Angel, do you want to join us? You got a question that you submitted in the chat. Do you want to join your voice to the conversation?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, I've owned 2 small businesses, started my first one in 2018 and the second one about 3 years ago. And, I hired my daughter in, which is I'm grateful for, and she does my admin, but looking to expand it, right? And unfortunately, I mentor, I teach, I coach, but I have still yet to find somebody that can mentor me. And so I was just wondering, if you're looking at expanding and growing a small business, I'm going to ask just the top 2 things that maybe we might be missing or we should focus more on to be successful in that growth?
Great question. So don't know if this is a good response or not, but I'll share it anyway, just because I've learned how to be vulnerable. Is that, what is a mentor the thing? Is having a mentor your number one priority in terms of your strategy for growing your business? No, it's
No.
not. What is your number one priority?
My number one priority is finding a good clients, right? I mean, I see clients sometimes are not always great. And so I've slowly learned to recognize that you don't have to take on every client, right? So I'm trying to be much more strategic about that portion. And to be honest, I read a lot, I learn a lot, I take every course I can. I try to do that. But the other thing I'm really trying to be strategic about is putting myself in better rooms. I think I've been in many rooms where it's very closed or you have just a small group in one specific industry. So I'm trying to be more strategic about whether I'm paying to go to conferences or events, um, that I'm finding bigger rooms to be in where there are a different group of individuals that I can both learn from and potentially sell to.
Great, great. That is so important for you to know that. My advice to you is high leverage networking. Okay. You are essentially selling yourself as a product, right? Or as a service. Selling yourself as a service. And when you're in that business, networking is, in my experience, the most important thing, the most important activity you can undertake. But do it in a high leveraged way. Okay. Love your dog, by the way. uh, so like you said, there are low leverage rooms and there are high leverage rooms, right? And only you know that about from your own experience as to where the leverage is. And LinkedIn may be that, it may not be. I just met somebody for the first time 48 hours ago who, after 15 minutes of talking with this person, I realized this is going to be a high leverage relationship for me, right? Because of who she knows and who she's connected with, right? And how and how interested she is in the work I'm doing. There are a lot of people who it's fun to know, fun to be with, fun to spend time with, fun to laugh with, but those aren't, from a business standpoint, those may not be high leverage relationships. So that's my advice to you: is invest in high leverage networking.
One thing I would add to that is um, be the kind of person that you want in your life. So you need to model the types of behavior, the the giving, not the taker, in these sorts of networking opportunities. Um, for me, it's trying to figure out, like, how can I give value to Mark Englizian? If I can figure out how to become valuable enough to him, he might say yes to come on the show. Like these things we need to be thinking about the other person. And then one last thing is, if you want to be like someone, go try to learn from them, go try to become valuable to that person, so that so that you can basically have that person as an audience. We only have thanks for the question, Angel. We only have a few minutes left. I wanted to touch on one more point, Mark, and then I'd like to wrap up. At the end of the book, you offer 5 keys to leadership maturity, which 3 minutes is not going to give this what it needs. But you talk about mature leaders are not easily offended. Mature leaders delegate to others for business strategy and operational excellence. Mature leaders focus on nurturing key stakeholder relationships in the ecosystem. Mature leaders stay focused on what's important and avoid constant distractions. Mature leaders are world-class investors. Why? I mean, that there's so much there. Maybe take one and say, what is it? What is it about becoming a mature leader? Because we're not all there. Obviously, we have a ways to go for developing those 5 things. But what's one thing?
So maturity is a concept that I embraced because the essence of the word conjures up an evolution, right? There is a process of being in progress, right? And I think we are all WIP. We're all work in progress if we allow ourselves to be, and if we embrace a life of learning. And so maturity is a word I selected very intentionally and thoughtfully. That's the first thing. I'll comment on 2 of these really quickly. Mature leaders are not easily offended. If you really know your stakeholders and you know what matters to them, you will not be surprised at anything they say or want. We get offended when people sneak up on us or throw us a curveball.
Mm.
And if you really know and understand who the people are in your ecosystem, it is much less likely that you will ever be thrown a curveball or ever get snuck up on. And so knowledge is power in that sense. And so you don't get offended when somebody says, gee, I hear you talking about shareholders a lot. What about employees? You're not offended by that statement like one CEO I had definitely was. The other thing I want to I'll just comment on briefly, is nurturing these stakeholder relationships. The easiest thing to do is to stay in your office or be a slave to your calendar. Have other people tell you how you should be spending your time.
Yeah.
Have your leadership team suck you into operational issues, right? The hardest thing to do is to get out of the office, to have your executive assistant or a chief of staff or whatever it is help you be balanced in where you're spending your time. Go visit your best customers. Go spend time with your suppliers. Go to Wall Street and talk to your investors or talk to the analysts. These are the things that you do to nurture relationships, and that's what mature leaders do. They don't just acknowledge them, they nurture the relationships.
Well, I would just say, I mean, I think to encapsulate all of those, it's like a mature leader serves the system. A mature leader serves all the stakeholders. A mature leader is not focused on themselves. And that's so rare, so hard to find, because it takes a certain amount of ego to rise to the level of, a CEO at a large company. But I think that maturity, as it develops over time, it's a really important concept, and I'm glad you put it in the book. Mark, any final thoughts as we close out? This has been a fun and very quick 1 hour.
It did go by fast, didn't it?
By, yeah.
Yeah. The only other thing I'll say about leadership is that we have this sort of false narrative that leaders are Bruce Willis, that they're like, gung ho and I'm the smartest and the strongest person in the room. I know where we're supposed to go. Follow me, right? No, I mean, you can do that, and there have been people who have done that, and they've done it successfully. But that's not the model I'm advocating. I'm advocating, listen, learn, then lead. And my dad, I'll finish with this. My dad, who was not a business person, but he was a reader and a learner, said to me one time, 3 steps ahead as a leader, 3 steps ahead, you're a leader. 10 steps ahead, you're a target.
Interesting. That's good. That's good advice. Very, very good advice. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Authors at Drucker on your launch day. I wish you the best of luck. For those that are listening to this, go invest a little bit of money and a little bit of time and learn about stakeholders. Your perspective and your maturity may change as you come out of the reading of that book. I hope you'll join me next time on the next Authors at Drucker. I'll have the opportunity to interview Dave Wharton, founder of the Tugboat Institute and author of Another Way, Building Companies That Last and Last and Last. Again, I'm glad you joined us for this conversation. Thanks for investing your time in us today, and make it a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Dave.